like to call your attention this morning to the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John. John chapter 6. We'll read together the first 14 verses. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we going to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew himself what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves, 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who was come into the world." This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Her name was Adley Hooker, and she remembers a time in her life when her and her family were going through such a financial difficult situation that there was hardly enough food for them to eat. Then one day her husband gave her a phone call that shocked her to death. He said that he had invited some people over for dinner. She thinks to herself, "We don't have enough to eat. And now he's invited some more people? What am I going to do?" So what does she do? She prays. She goes to her room. She gets on her knees. And she begins to ask God what to do. And as she prayed, she seemed to hear a voice telling her, "You have meat in the freezer, don't you?" She said, "Yes, about a half a pound of hamburger." That wouldn't go too far, she thought. Then the voice said, "You have vegetables?" "Well, yes, half an onion, 2 carrots, and a little stunted growth potato. But what is that going to do?" Not very likely to feed 6 people. But then the voice told her to make a stew and to use the rest of her flour for biscuits. She says to herself, "It will never work. I will be embarrassed. We will run out of food. It's just not going to work." But she does it. She does it anyway. She makes a stew. She makes biscuits. She plans to tell her husband before the meal that they are only to eat biscuits, to let the guests have the stew. They sit down. They ask God to bless the food that they are about to eat, and they began to fill the stew bowls. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They eat that. There's seconds for everybody. There's even leftover stew. To this day, she says, God gave her a miracle. To this day, she says it was only because of the hand of God that she had enough and even more than she needed. That's exactly what our text is saying today. And as we've been going through John's gospel, you may think, well, we see miracle after miracle after miracle. And it does seem like that. But John only records 7 miracles in the whole book. And each one of those he calls a sign. And remember, we don't have to wonder why John is writing his book. He tells us. He tells us that if he'd written down everything Jesus had done, that there wouldn't be enough books in the whole world to contain it. But what he chose, he wrote so that we might believe. And that we might have life because we believe. The text before us today is the only miracle that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. We find it recorded in Matthew, in Mark, in Luke, and in John. So if it's in all 4 Gospels, we better pay attention. What does this miracle have to teach us today? This miracle that happened so long ago. What can we learn from it? Several things. The first thing I want you to see is that Jesus attracts the crowds, but he welcomes each person. Since it's recorded in all 4 Gospels, it might help to look and see what some of the other Gospels say. Mark tells us that his disciples and Jesus were actually trying to get away. They were trying to get away for a little rest, a little relaxation. They had had a tough time recently, and they needed some time to be by themselves. So they go up to a mountain, and everywhere Jesus goes, it seems like the people were following him. He just could not get rid of the people. He needed some private time. He needed some time with his disciples. But instead, we're told in Mark's gospel that when the crowds come, he sees them and he has compassion on them. Because he sees that they're like sheep without a shepherd. I love this about Jesus. Jesus was a people person. Jesus knew what his mission was. Jesus said in Luke 19, the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. That was his mission. You see, people were his mission. And it didn't matter what Jesus was feeling like. It didn't matter what Jesus had to do. Jesus was always ready to stop for a single person. We're told that he's on his way to Jairus' house, the synagogue leader's house, to help his little girl. And remember, a lady crawls through the crowd. She reaches out. She touches the hem of his garments. There's a crowd of people everywhere. He's on his way to the religious leader's house. And what does he do? He stops. He stops. He turns around because he knew there was a lady there who needed him. He's on his way back from Passover. There has been a lot of controversy in Jerusalem. He's got a lot to do, but the Bible says he needed to go through Samaria. Why? Because there was a lady at a well who needed some hope. It didn't matter what Jesus was doing. He was on his way to Jerusalem for the Passover, his last Passover. He's walking through, they're basically having a parade for him in Jericho. He looks up in a tree, a sycamore tree. He sees somebody who needs him, and the parade comes to a stop because he says, Zacchaeus, today I need to go to your house. You see, for Jesus, Jesus doesn't see a crowd. Jesus sees each person. And Jesus knows what you're going through today. And he sees you. And he is a God of compassion. He's a God who can reach out. He's a God who loves you. Well, we're told in another gospel, Luke, that when the disciples see all these people come, They say, Jesus, send them away. Jesus, send all these people away. But Jesus says to them, you feed them. You give them something to eat. I love what he says. For this is the second thing we see. Jesus asks us to do the impossible because he wants to test us. You give them something to eat. Can't you see the look on the disciples' face? We're out here in the middle of nowhere. Where are we going to find bread? Where are we going to find food for all this multitude? No way. No way. Now, John tells us that Jesus already knew what he was going to do. Jesus already knew he was going to perform a miracle. He already knew exactly what he was going to do. But he says, you give them something to eat. There were two problems there that day. First of all, there was a lack of food. The people were on their way to Passover. There was a lot of people there. You just couldn't go and stop by McDonald's in that day. There was not a McDonald's. So there was a lack of food. But there was also a lack of faith. The disciples lacked faith. Now, we've already seen miracle after miracle in John. We have already seen when the wine ran out, it wasn't a problem for Jesus. He takes water, he makes wine. When the nobleman's son is sick in a different town, remember Jesus is in Cana, the young man is in Capernaum, 20 miles away. Not a problem for Jesus. Your son's going to be better. He was. A man had been lying by a pool 38 years. Jesus walks up to him and says, take up your mat and walk. The disciples have witnessed all of this. You would think one of them would say, hey, Jesus, do that thing you did back in Cana when the wine ran out. You would think they said, well, Jesus, you can make a man walk who hasn't walked for 38 years. Can't you do something about this? But not a one of them speak up and say, well, Jesus, it's time for you to shine. We do find one of the disciples doing something, though. His name is Andrew. His name is Andrew. Every time you see Andrew in the Gospels, he's bringing somebody to Jesus. He's always bringing somebody to Jesus. What a great example for us. Andrew says, well, there's a little boy here. He's got a little lunch. He's got, a few little barley loaves, a couple of fish. But even Andrew says, what's that among so many? Now, when you hear the word loaf there, when you hear the word fish there, don't think like you go down to the grocery store and you see this big loaf of bread. That's not what it was. No. It was probably flat. It was probably round and about the size of your hand. So you got 5 flat, brittle, hard pieces of bread and 2 little minnows, 2 little sardines. That's what he's got. The disciples must have had a knot in their throat. They must have had butterflies in their stomach when Jesus takes this tiny amount of food and tells them to make the people sit down. Can you imagine? I bring a little Happy Meal out. And I say, all right, we're having a covered dish lunch. And I'm going to cater it this time, though. You don't have to bring anything. And here I bring out this little Happy Meal. Here's our lunch. Some of you would think I'd lost it. I wonder what the disciples thought when Jesus takes this little boy's lunch and says, okay, tell everybody to sit down. And we're told that he looks up to heaven. He asked God to bless it. And he broke the loaves. It's singular in the original Greek. In other words, with one break, he breaks all 5 loaves. That's how small they were. That's how thin they were. That's how brittle they were. And he says to the disciples, start passing it out. There's only 5 tiny little loaves. And the disciples each take a piece. And they start giving them out. And they start giving them out. And they keep giving them out. And they keep giving them out. Wouldn't you love to have looked on the faces of the disciples as they were doing this? Oh, it must have been a marvelous feeling, because it just kept coming. It just kept coming. It just kept coming. And everybody ate. And everybody got all they wanted. And at the end of the story, they're going and they're picking up 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Wow. It's amazing what God can do. Because Jesus accepts what we offer him, even if we think it's not enough. Listen to that again. Jesus accepts what we offer him, even if we think it's not enough. You know, when I get to heaven, I want to meet that little boy who had the lunch. Because that little boy gave Jesus all he had. All he had. And when Jesus adds his power to our poverty, the result is plenty. That's good. When Jesus adds his power to our poverty, the result is plenty. Your little can become a lot when first you look up to heaven for your help. What did the psalmist say? I look to the hills from where my help comes from. My help comes from the Lord. You might feel overwhelmed today. Right now, your life may be spinning out of control, and you may think there is no way I can handle this. My suggestion, look up. Look up. Thank God for the little you already have. Thank God for the little you already have. And see the value of brokenness. Before the disciples could pass out the loaves, Jesus broke them. You've heard me say often lately, especially when we've been looking at the life of David, that God, before he can do anything great in your life, has to break you first. And when Jesus does something, there's always leftovers. It's amazing. 12 basketfuls of leftovers. How many disciples were there? 12. He knows the journey's going to be rough for them. And he wants them in the days to come to have something to look back on and remember just how powerful he is. Maybe I'm talking to somebody today, and all you've got is a little. It's not nearly enough. Maybe your finances are just, they're so bad. You've got a little and you need a lot. Maybe your marriage, you're just holding on by a string. You need a lot and you've just got one little string left. Maybe your health is fading, and it's getting worse and worse and worse every day. Jesus can still do the impossible. Look up. Thank him for what you have. Then sit back and watch him do the impossible. That's just how Jesus works.